China's government has openly formulated its ambition to make the country a leading scientific power. So how do its political regime and social structures influence the way science is practiced? How is scientific knowledge used for political governance in China? And what does this mean for science globally? Annalisa Ahlers leads a research group at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. The group explores the many facets of China's stunning recent ascent in the global system of science. Anna Ahlers has long been fascinated by China. The political sociologist and sinologist studied at the University of Tübingen, the Beijing and Renmin universities in China, and at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. After her PhD in China studies, she was based at the Forum Internationale Wissenschaft in Bonn and at MERIX, Germany's leading think tank on China. She later moved to Norway to become an associate professor at the University of Oslo. During this time, she also spent a year as a visiting associate professor at the University of Chicago. In 2020, Anna Ahlers joined the Max Planck Society to lead a new Lise Meitner research group at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. She is currently also a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin and a board member of the Junge Akademie. Anna Ahlers' work has ranged from local policy making in China's rural reconstruction programs to what is known as the urban war against smog. Her new research group will continue to explore the complex relationships between politics and science in Chinese society, international academic cooperation, and world science.
Good evening, everyone, and a big thank you to Stephanie Hood for this kind introduction, and to the organizers of the Berlin Science Week, of course, as well as the colleagues at the Max Planck Society Central Administration for inviting me to give this lecture and for preparing it for so many weeks now. When advertising this lecture, I chose the subtitle, "What does it mean for the global system of science when an autocratically ruled country attempts to become its biggest player?" Looking at how China's tremendous rise in the system of science over the last 2 decades is commonly covered in the media, and I brought you some headlines here from newspapers and science magazines, you easily get a feeling for what is at stake when these questions are asked. In one of the articles, a piece in The Guardian in 2014 that you see on the left side, the author even wondered whether an avalanche of Chinese science will change the way science is practiced globally. The common theme here seems to be that while there is an inevitable acknowledgement of the breathtaking developments, the massive expansion, and the clear breakthroughs of Chinese science in general, there is also always unease. China is not just another country, but a rapidly rising world political and economic power with the largest population, immense resources and ambitions. Not only is what is happening there immediately happening at an enormous scale, but we are also talking about one of the world's most durable autocracies, the one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And so there's always a suspicion that whatever happens there is highly political, rather intransparent, and a bit unsettling. In the midst of well-founded concerns and sensational reporting, I would say that these reactions are also fueled by the fact that we just don't know enough about how science and scholarship is working and is practiced in China. Let me give you one more and probably a more concrete example, and one that seems almost unavoidable. The coverage of the COVID-19 crisis in China, where we find all these traits again. Without delving too much into all the details, I would like to quickly draw your attention to the paradox of scientific capability and constraints, and especially the complex interrelations of science and politics on display again in communications between scientists, the government, and eventually the World Health Organization. This quote on the slide from an investigative report of the Associated Press nicely captures the differentiation that is necessary when we seek to understand how different actors played their parts in what was going on last winter. It reads, and I cut out sentences from different sections of the text, scientists agree that Chinese scientists detected and sequenced the then unknown pathogen with astonishing speed, in a testimony to China's vastly improved technical capabilities since SARS in 2003, as you might remember. Chinese government labs only released the genome after another lab, a private one, published it ahead of the authorities on a virologist's website on January 11th. And finally, WHO staffers debated how to press China for gene sequences and detailed patient data without angering authorities, worried about losing access and getting Chinese scientists into trouble. So you clearly see that while political pressure was put on Chinese scientists once it was clear that a disaster was unfolding, scientists first did what scientists do. They tested something that seemed abnormal, were able to sequence the new virus in record time, and independently shared this information through scientific channels with their global peers. Only later were they placed under gag orders by governmental authorities and was public information about the outbreak and the new virus censored. Interestingly enough, prominent scientists began to play roles that can maybe be compared to the Dr. Fauci's or Drostens in North America and Europe as a second and potentially more trustworthy force besides the government that the public could turn to in times of anxiety. In the long run, the Chinese government has succeeded in gaining the upper hand in this triangle and in instrumentalizing most of these scientific heroes for its cause. All of them are also internationally renowned and often heavily integrated experts who now come forward with all sorts of tell-all stories, and again, I've brought you some screenshots from these media reports, about the early phase of COVID-19 in China in English language media, apparently to save both their own reputation and that of the Chinese authorities in a kind of science diplomacy effort. This role distinction in this pandemic is a very interesting story that my research group will look further into, as I believe it provides many insights into the functional differentiation of science and politics in Chinese society, or the lack thereof. For the moment, I would just like to stress the ambivalence again that we see here. While it is difficult to detect real scientific autonomy in China or scientific conduct that is completely independent of the political environment and of direct political steering, it is also much too easy to see scientists and scholars or science as a whole as merely a puppet of the state and to deny Chinese scientists of all agency, intrinsic motivation, and pockets of professional discretion. So moving towards the bigger picture again, a short note on what I would like to do tonight. I would like to give you a brief overview of what has happened with regard to developments in the national science system in China and the impact of this expansion on the global system of science. It is, of course, impossible to cover all aspects of this gargantuan story in just 30 minutes, so I will highlight a few trends that I find especially noteworthy. Instead of presenting you with sheer numbers and spectacular stories of scientific breakthroughs that you can easily find everywhere else, I will rather try to draw some storylines and pose questions that will need scrutinizing in studies that are yet lacking, in my view. Given the time limit today, I will focus especially on the ambiguity found in the interrelation of scholarship and politics in China, that in my observation draws so much public attention, and that is also fruitful for further theoretical engagements with this topic. Here on the slide you see the main points that I would like today, and for which I brought you some examples. We will look briefly at the strategic planning that has been going on in Chinese national science planning, look at how dynamic and adaptive this science political planning has been. We look at all the asymmetries and also the limited autonomy that we find in the Chinese science system. But I would also like to point out a few of the reasons why I think that China's massive expansion comes about with so much friction in the global system of science. And I've listed these examples here. The first three, so a preference for quantity over quality, enormous pressure within the system on scholars in China, and the very high degree of politicization and censorship that we see, of course, plays out in China as such. The fourth point is, however, also important to make, as I think that state governments and the scientific community around the world have very different ways of reacting to the dynamics that are unfolding around China's scientific rise, and this in itself causes frictions again. But allow me to start with some very brief historic overview of what should be underlined and why I think the case of China is so fascinating and worth studying in depth. One could, of course, say, well, isn't this just one more case of the politicization of science or a new Cold War? Haven't we seen this all before, especially in the 20th century? I would say that historic comparisons are, of course, helpful in some regards, but in others, they do not travel too far here. Things today look different from the world in the 20th century, and they look differently in the case of China. Science and politics were always in a complex relationship in Chinese history. Chinese civilization has a long history of respect and valuation of knowledge and scholarship. The ideal of the scholar official or the literati and the narrative of meritocracy characterizes long stretches of Chinese imperial history. The appeal of modern science and technology also played a major role in the movement that led to the end of imperial rule in China in the early 20th century. For the governments of the Republican era from 1912, as well as for the Chinese Communist Party that won the Civil War and founded the People's Republic of China in 1949, advanced knowledge, science, technology, and expertise were a major component of their legitimation strategies, an attempt at distinction from past traditional regimes, and also a core element of their international engagements and cooperation. But it was also under the leadership of Mao Zedong in the early decades of Communist Party rule that science and scholarship faced its biggest perils. Especially the anti-rightist campaign and the Cultural Revolution were the time when science and scholars were mostly subjected to exclusion and suppression, ideological control, and heavy political instrumentalization and command. Since the Reform and Opening era under Deng Xiaoping after 1978, this has changed. Overall, science, technology, and scholarship have become a tool and a goal in itself again. Policy making became more pragmatic, and having access to the latest scientific insights became crucially important for social development, China's economic boom, and its growing global outreach. The Chinese government hails Chinese scientific breakthroughs also with an eye on China's international reputation and global competition. But I would argue this happens today in a fashion that is much more similar to that of other nations and their utilization or politicization of science than in the era of heavy traditional ideologization before. And on the pictures here, you see two examples where I think we clearly see the difference. You see Lysenko, who in the Soviet Union were meant to prove the superiority of socialism in his highly ideologized biology, whereas Yuan Longping in the People's Republic of China, who was the developer of hybrid rice, was hailed as someone that brought microphone problems. So Yuan Longping, the founder of or the developer of hybrid rice, was hailed by the Chinese government as someone who, under very harsh conditions, made major scientific breakthroughs, and then hybrid rice was offered to the world in order to solve common problems of food shortage. So in short, the political leadership in the academic elite in China is not working towards establishing Chinese science as an alternative reality. It is fully embracing the one global system of science of the 21st century with its rules of the game, institutions, and inclusion formulas. Also, Chinese society in general is on average strongly embracing modern science and technology. The population is highly educated and has means to access and use scientific information in many different ways than this was the case in the last century. Scholarly expertise and scientific analyses also re-enter the policy process as a value in itself, I would say. While researching on environmental governance in the Chinese local state, I was astonished to see the degree to which involved actors such as governmental bureaus, local protesters, non-governmental organizations, the media and others brought forward and handled complex scientific data in struggles around local pollution issues. Some 10 years ago, policies and law were usually the go-to tools for protesters against official mismanagement and to hold others to account. Now it is precise scientific analyses. So this is the background against which all of this is playing out, I would say. Coming back to science policy in China, what has happened in recent decades that enabled China's scientific ascent? I would see this as a long-term strategy based on a science bureaucracy in the Martonian sense. While maybe not all steps could be planned at the very beginning, and often we see dynamic adaptation, scientific reconstruction in China since the late 1970s is staggeringly gradual and systematic. First, and I have noted the major steps in Chinese science policy since the reform and opening era, was the reconstruction of the Chinese university and education system, the massification of the Chinese university. Then it shifted more and more towards really rebuilding a research infrastructure with a 5-year or the 15-year plans and other plans for science and technology. The major one was amended again in 2012 and 15, and we are currently awaiting its renewal in potentially 2020 or 2021. In these plans, the government also points to specific fields and disciplines that will especially be supported, such as the life sciences, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, space tech, and much more. It also moved gradually from a focus on applied research to basic research and real innovation. Aligned with this is a focus on recruitment of global talent, and I'm sure all of you have heard about the 1,000 Talent program before, and there's also a double first-class university plan meant to make Chinese universities competitive on a global scale. What are the consequences of this planning? Now I will finally get to show you a bit of the data and some numbers. We begin with money, of course, not very surprisingly. I printed out research and development funding in China in relation to gross domestic expenditure and GDP in the country. And you see this very steep rise. It's a dark red line, starting at the bottom in the left corner and then dramatically rising over time. It is now estimated that by 2019 and 20, China is surpassing the USA in R&D spending. Of course, R&D spending is a mixed bag. It doesn't only cover spending on science and research happening at the universities, but at least it gives you some indication, and I think this line is rather striking. The same rise you see when looking at the human resources working in science and technology. And again, this is a mixed picture. It's not only covering universities, but again, I think it gives you a rather good indication of what is happening here. It also points to, of course, the number of people that are educated and the scientists who now work in R&D fields. Compared to the US, China is now heavily on the rise. It doesn't surprise us so much with such a big total population that it fares much higher and better than Germany here. But of course, if you look at the line at the bottom, that's India. And India, of course, has a population that is roughly comparable to that of China. And you see these very striking differences. More money again here with a clearer focus on classic research and science. The grants allocated in the fields of natural sciences, STEM, and social sciences and the humanities. you can see that both fields rise in relative terms. And of course, for us, the difference between funding for hard sciences and soft sciences is not so surprising. But in absolute terms, but in relative terms, you see that both the funding in both fields is on the rise. And then publications, of course, one of the most often and heavily used indicators to demonstrate the enormousness of what has happened over the last 20 years. That is the increase in scientific publications by Chinese authors or by authors affiliated with Chinese institutions. More than 20% of the global share of scientific papers are now coming out of China. The US comes in second at 18.3%. For a while, this was qualified by the fact that this output in absolute terms was not matched by citations as an indicator of the acceptancy and the quality of scientific publications. And this was well in line with the observation that the notion of publish or perish in academia can be taken quite literally in the Chinese case. Income and careers are highly dependent on sometimes totally unrealistic publication goals, pushed further by uncontrolled competition among institutions and individuals. This has side effects such as monetary rewards handed out for publishing in high-impact international journals. Lending a piece in Science or Nature could easily earn you about $50,000 US, or the notorious paper mills, that is, companies that are producing ready-made manuscripts, sometimes based on fake data, to desperate researchers. But gradually, this is also changing. Chinese publications now also rise rapidly in global citation indexes. And you can see that in the two graphs here. On the left side is the social the Science Citation Index, and on the right hand, the Social Science Citation Index. Again, you see a stark difference in the overall turnout, in the overall output, but both are very clearly on the rise. Especially the quantitative social sciences, I would say, leave their mark globally. However, it must be mentioned that STEM and the social sciences and humanities are in very different positions when it comes to governmental steering and intervention. While for STEM, science policy clearly creates a certain corridor and national and global instrumentalization of the hard sciences is strong, the social sciences and the humanities face a different quality of supervision in China. While in STEM policy, some fields are promoted and some are neglected, for the social sciences and the humanities, some topics are just completely taboo and can even culminate in physical harm to the scholar. Monetary rewards for social scientists and humanities scholars were always much lower than for STEM colleagues, or sometimes just completely absent. But some publications are sometimes also just purely impossible, have to be painstakingly censored, or can get you into trouble retrospectively. When traveling and presenting on conferences internationally, telling the China success story, which is now a major task for Chinese scholars, means starting with a few added framing sentences for STEM researchers, while for social scientists it can mean that they will need to tweak or hollow out their whole contribution and argument. This all has become ever more pronounced under the more centralized leadership of the Xi Jinping administration since 2013. Altogether, the disunity of science is the obvious cost of an authoritarian control of science and scholarship, I would say. And it remains to be seen if real scientific leadership is possible on this basis. An attempt by the Chinese government at international outreach is nonetheless clear. Many different funding schemes, and I don't have the time to present them all here, are ranging from classical stipend programs to matching international research funds to allocating money for joint research centers and commercial R&D purposes around the world. Our group is currently gathering more data on all of this. What is clear is that China has moved from being a receiver of foreign science funding to a sponsor of science and scholarship around the world. In line with the previous observation, China is increasingly integrating science and education in its foreign policy initiatives. While Confucius institutes around the world, including in industrialized nations, are old hat, by now new initiatives along the New Silk Road and in Africa and Latin America are now part of the government's plans. Often they rather resemble development aid programs than a cooperation at eye level. The asymmetry and unconditionality involved is seen by observers as something similar to what is happening in other domains, such in the field of Chinese economic aid and infrastructural projects abroad. Yet, like in these other fields, we also need more and better empirical analyses to understand the motives and effects characterizing Chinese foreign science policy. It should also be mentioned that China has for a long time offered comprehensive scholarship programs. In former decades, students from socialist ally states were hosted in China. Nowadays, the Chinese Scholarship Council grants stipends for students around the world, similar to the German DAAD. At the postdoctorate and senior researcher level, the many thousand fellowships for African researchers and, of course, the 1,000 Talent program should be mentioned. In both cases, we have tried that. It's very difficult to obtain precise information about participant demographics. The group is on it, but it will take a while before we have very, very substantial data. But this data seems to be handled with great caution and sensitivity, at least on the Chinese side. Especially the 1,000 Talent program has drawn attention by foreign governments, as it seems to sometimes encourage espionage and corruption, and is on the brink of being revised, or at least of being relabeled. Another tricky aspect of the internationalization of Chinese science for the political leadership is how to balance the need for the country to be a full player in the global game with all its uncertainties and the desire to uphold domestic political control. I mentioned the pressure on Chinese scientists and scholars to publish internationally. Paradoxically, some of the outlets that promise most publication credit points are censored for scholars and other readers within China. Here you see an example of one specific journal. The green squares show what is available when you search for these terms in the journal being based in China, and the rest is accessible abroad. So that's a striking difference of what is accessible for readers within China and outside of China. More shockingly even, is that foreign publishers aid and abet this censorship and exclusion. You may have heard about these cases in recent years. It was the foreign publishers who made and who make the content inaccessible via their websites in China on the behest of Chinese political authorities. Upon loud protest by the scientific community, some publishers, such as Cambridge University Press, stopped this practice, while others, such as Springer Nature, stick to it. Moreover, it is clear that this is again pitting STEM content against social sciences and the humanities, as these publishers gave into pressure from China in order not to endanger their overall subscriptions from China, of which the bulk is still in the fields of science, engineering, law, medicine, and others. Other recent trends, which will likely affect international scientific cooperation at the stage of inquiry already, are increasing attempts at a nationalization of research data by the Chinese government. While this is done in other contexts as well, for example for ethical reasons, in this case a misuse of this mechanism for political reasons seems very likely. In the article quoted here, a statement by the US-American National Science Foundation is referred to, which expressed concern about the possibility that US-funded research cannot be implemented as planned when data collected in China cannot be used in publications because it is held up in screening procedures on the Chinese side. So far, it is hard to gauge what exactly will be the practical impact of these new rules. The effects so far, at least to my knowledge, seem to be weaker than expected, but having this hanging over their heads, of course, can potentially indirectly impact researchers' conduct and their willingness to collaborate, I would say, something that we will need to find out more about in recent years. As I mentioned in the beginning, it is too easy to take a completely one-sided perspective on all these issues, partly as a reaction to Chinese activities, partly due to long-standing conflicts and against the background of other political motives, international science politics has become more antagonistic in recent years. The row between the US and China is the most significant conflict and the one most visibly affecting educational and scientific exchanges. A few days ago, Nikkei Asia reported that US visa for Chinese students have fallen by 99% this year as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the tensions between the two countries. Around the world, universities, labs, R&D departments and others become much more skeptical vis-à-vis cooperation with Chinese counterparts and even individual Chinese researchers. This is possibly the grimmest effect of the anxiety surrounding China's scientific rise in recent years. Inconsistency, singling out a new Cold War mentality, and an across-the-board suspiciousness vis-à-vis researchers of Chinese nationality. While this is all much more tangible in the US already, in Europe, I also sense a heightened expectation by the public that institutions and even researchers, especially sinologists or China scholars, position themselves principally versus China. Ever since politics in China have become more heavy-handedly authoritarian under Xi Jinping and China is becoming stronger on the global scene, the country's image among the publics of other countries has deteriorated and general counter-reflexes become stronger. Finally, some recent adjustments in Chinese science policies seem to be a reaction to allegations of academic corruption and fraud and a general skepticism about the quality of Chinese research. These adjustments also once again bespeak the extreme dynamic and adaptability of Chinese science policymaking, in my view. Here I've listed just a few. In recent years, the policies guiding hiring practices and also a publication of academic data has been revised. Just this year, we have seen new policy guidelines asking for a stronger focus on Chinese publications, so not only the ones in the high-ranking international journals, but especially in Chinese publications, and a move away from purely quantitative targets to more qualitative targets. What the effects of these policy changes will be remains to be seen. So I've laid out all this data and all the stories connected to it. How can we analytically approach this all, the dynamic, the ambivalence, the effects of China's scientific rise, and much more, and what can be a basis for theorizing about it? I have advertised in-depth research a few times already in my talk, and this is probably finally the place where I can do some PR for my new research group. I would like to draw your attention to how we plan to work and what you can look forward to in the coming years. What is there to start with? When we look at contemporary issues, I would say not so much. And it is this gap, I would argue, that is an obvious argument for having this group. If you look at, of course, the excellent publications on history of science and technology in China, on the Mao era, scientific elites, and on very particular topics such as epidemics and ensuing policies, there is a lot to learn. There's also much focus, of course, on these high-tech developments, artificial intelligence, and I would say we have a small tradition of science anthropology in China, and this is the latest publication on the right side. What we are lacking, I would say, is more sociological or social anthropological perspectives on the Chinese science system and of China in the global system of science. That is, research that not only looks at the evolution of specific technologies or of epistemology, but that systematically bridges science and what is happening in society overall. Studies that are treating science and scholarship as a function system of its own kind, but one that is embedded in societal structures and norms. And I think that was raised already in the trailer, so you are prepared for this. Given my own training and previous research questions, I am personally especially interested in how the structures of science in China and of Chinese global academic corporations are influenced by the ambient authoritarian regime and vice versa. This, for me, also links the case of China to more universal questions, such as how to deal with the traditional notion that science and innovative scholarship can only flourish in democratic societies in the 21st century. Besides this macro framework for the group, we have tried to identify 4 core research areas which break down these larger issues into conceptual fields. And you can see them on this slide. It is interesting for us to know and to study what the status of science in today's Chinese society is. Are there alternative visions of, for instance, what we claim to be important, the autonomy of science in society and other ideas? The structures, dimensions, and norms of China's contemporary science policy, a very comprehensive study of the developments that I've just briefly laid out, and the changes over time. The steering versus agency of scientific communities, networks, and individuals. What room do they have? Is it really just political steering that is driving Chinese research, or is it original intrinsic motivation? And how are these boundaries defined? And of course, the interactions of scientific standards and practices with societal values and ethical principles in China and beyond. There's sometimes these stories that we see European researchers moving to China because they might find much more freedom for wild experimentation that is not harnessed in any way by ethical rules, which I think is a myth, but that's something we would like to study further in this group. So these are also transversal topics that allow us to pool insights from individual research in the group, to publish together, and to make our work accessible for other researchers working on comparable topics. And to just give you a very quick impression of the diversity of projects, individual projects in the group that we are talking about, I've brought you this overview. There are some more projects coming in that are not covered by this picture, but I think you can already get an idea of what I'm talking about if I talk about diversity. I cannot go through all the individual projects and their descriptions. You will find them on our group homepage, and I can only warmly recommend that to you to learn more. But I think you can also easily see from the titles of these projects how these very specific topics tie in again with the core research areas that I've just laid out. So you have something on the ethics of artificial intelligence research in China, the role played by Chinese Arctic researchers when they're sent out as partly diplomats, partly scientists, the development of disciplines like African studies in China in the light of Chinese new foreign policy directions, and much more. So let me conclude by pulling together the threads mentioned along the way in this lecture. It is especially the diversity of this group and of the affiliated projects that can, I hope, eventually help us gauge the initial question raised in this lecture of whether China is on its way of becoming a science superpower. While you can well argue that the numbers are clearly saying that China is already formally one, it is then interesting to ask what kind of superpower China is or will be. Quantitative indicators tell us one important story, but we also need to pay more attention to in-depth qualitative insights on the many different facets of this story to really answer this question. Does China manage to become a worldwide center of science and scholarship that is able to attract the best researchers who are then willing to spend a considerable amount of time there, maybe even make it their home? If not, why? For example, is this intentional? Maybe even an acknowledgement of the value of a non-territorially bound system of science? Or is it actually attempted but still hampered by certain frictions and incompatibilities? Is China on the way to making real, innovative, sustainable, and competitive contributions that go beyond applied research and technology? So apart from 5G technologies, for instance, do we see breakthroughs in basic sciences, in social theory or economics? In other words, in universal theory as such? We need to go really deep and into breadth to find out, I would say. Directly connected to that, how Chinese is Chinese science really? Assuming that science and scholarship is international by nature, we in the group want to critically approach these categories whenever they are evoked. That means studying in as much detail as possible how scholarship is attributed in national and in personal categories, by whom and what for. Lastly, how political is science and scholarship undertaken in and by China, and how politicized is it abroad? And what does this mean for international collaboration with researchers and institutions in or from this country? A question that, at least from my experience by now, seems to be one of the most burning ones when people hear about this new research group. Where are the red lines and where are windows for opportunity? While in the group we do not intend to produce policy advice in the first place, we hope that our detailed and strictly analytical assessments can in the long run also lead to more informed decision-making in all these regards and on all sides. Especially, we hope that while shedding light on the really tricky issues in global research cooperation and the potentially incompatible differences in the societal embedding of science and scholarship in different countries and under different political regimes, our insights can help mitigate the current polarization, antagonism, and across-the-board conviction that hurt individuals and their research careers and not at least hinder overall progress in the sciences and humanities. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you especially for this really fascinating insight into China in the global system of science. I'm very excited, and I'm sure the audience will agree, it's very exciting to see where this research will go next. I should add that we at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science just released a podcast called Science Social, where we take a close-up look at what science and society and history can tell us about wider issues, and Anna is our first protagonist. So if you'd like to learn more about China and the global system of science, you can find the podcast on our website, as well as lots more information about all of the research topics that you have in your group. I have to make also an announcement about the Max Planck events taking place for Science Week tomorrow, also by live stream. So tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. you can watch lectures and discussions on the topic of fair and social handling of research data. And at 7 p.m. the Max Planck lecture on exploring the universe with gravitational waves. You'll find more information on the Max Planck Society website. So thank you very, very much to Anna. Thank you to the audience, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.